Hello and a very good afternoon to you. Thank you so much for joining us today for this GDV live webinar. Today we're taking a deep dive into the future of finance and specifically the financial data access and payments package that we know the European Commission put forward those proposals to bring the wider financial sector into the digital age. There's a lot to talk about. There's a lot of questions about how do we deliver what we want to see for the future. And I am delighted to have joining me three experts who can really help us get into the nitty-gritty. I want to encourage everyone over the next hour to get involved. I know people are following live on LinkedIn from across Europe and maybe even further afield. Feel free to please put your questions in the chat and we'll try to get to as many of those as we can over the next hour. With that, let me introduce you to our speakers today. Joining us from the European Commission, the Head of Unit of Digital Finance, Jan Sessens. We also have Jens Gammelmark, who is the Director of Development at PSA Pension. And finally, from the GDV, German Insurance Association, the Coordination Officer of Digitalization, Judith Storm. Thank you all so much for joining us today. Let me start, Jan, with you. Why this proposal? Where do you see the biggest potential? What is it all about? Give us the Commission thinking and set the scene for us.
Yeah, thank you very much, Jen, and thanks very much to GDV for organizing this event today. So why have we from the Commission made this proposal? Now, you know that I don't have to tell you that data is the future of a big part of our economy, certainly the big part of the future of finance. And in that sense, from the European Commission, we have worked actually since several years now really on a comprehensive data strategy for Europe to actually really allow the benefits of the data economy to be harnessed in the EU, in Europe. We know that in Europe we have a quite diversified economy, and that also applies to the financial sector. That means data is not held by few very large companies, few large gatekeepers or other firms, but indeed it is widely spread indeed among the economy. And that means also if you want to engage in data-driven innovation, actually the possibility to, in a responsible way, access and share data is essential. And the financial data access proposal actually looks at a particular part of this data economy, namely customer data, which is of course a particularly sensitive area, because indeed this is not only about making innovation possible. That's certainly something which customers and clients want more and more. Digital customers want even more, but it is also indeed about responsibility in data access and making sure that data is only used for the purposes where actually the data subjects agree to it and to the extent actually they want the data to be used. So within that broader context, actually, from the European Commission, we have presented over the past 3-4 years a couple of proposals on indeed an overhauling data act for the EU, and then indeed on sectoral data spaces in the different sectors, which actually sit together. They're the building blocks indeed all together of a broader European actually data economy. But indeed we need to, let's say, have in place both the overarching, let's say, framework and indeed also specific frameworks in specific sectors, because financial customer data is not the same than energy data, health data, or other areas of data. And so we've rolled this out with a various number of proposals on the health data space, on the Digital Markets Act, on the platform data. And now indeed we have made a proposal on the financial sector customer data. We have not started there either from scratch. You are probably aware of the Payment Service Directive 2, which has been in place in Europe for some time, and which indeed has created actually a first framework for data access in the payment sector. We've looked at this, learned the lessons actually also from this implementing. I think overall a success, overall something which has actually encouraged a lot of innovation in this area, but also sometimes here and there maybe at a bit excessive costs or a lot of effort actually. And so when we then indeed thought about, let's say, creating a framework which looks indeed at financial data beyond payments, we found it important indeed to take, let's say, to take these lessons, to fit this also into the broader framework, and also try to develop something which actually puts a lot of focus on industry cooperation indeed. And that's what we have now with our proposals. I think there are really two pillars here. One is indeed the responsibility part, making sure that customers are really in control, that this idea of the GDPR of consent is actually really implemented in practice, for example, through dashboards, risk management dashboards, for example, through guaranteeing that only licensed and supervised entities can actually access data. These are just two examples. For this the responsibility of data sharing part and trust part. And the second part is indeed then for those customers who want actually their data to also be accessed maybe by other firms for benefiting innovative products, maybe digital advice, maybe comparison dashboards or others. For those indeed also to enable this data access and data sharing between financial institutions and indeed also with fintechs, basically. And on this second part, indeed, we are proposing what is, I think, the 101 in this area. It is important to standardize data. It is important to make clear what data is shared, what are the conditions, what's the liability. And all of this, however, is not something where the legislator is best placed actually to take the real decisions, because that's really something which should be done by the people in the sector. So we are proposing indeed that the financial sector sets up so-called financial data sharing schemes, actually, which are, let's say, I would say, broader contractual and standardization frameworks within which then actually these various items are looked at, considered, and then indeed individual data sharing can happen based on standards, based actually on common liability, let's say, requirements, etc. So that's, I think, in a nutshell, what we have proposed, starting indeed from the bigger topic and the bigger context that each and all of our companies in Europe will need to face the challenges of the data economy, will need to face clients which are more and more demanding also in terms of data-driven services. And I think with the proposal we've made, we are also taking a step to help indeed financial institutions to also meet and live up to this demand. And at the same time, I think we're trying to do it in a responsible way, cultivating trust, and also in a way which puts a lot of emphasis and efforts on the financial sector itself, because we think ultimately in the end, the data economy is something where probably 95% must be done indeed by the economy. Just 5% is probably the regulatory part.
Well, thank you very much indeed, Jan, for setting that out. Now, obviously, as you say, financial data, it's not the same as energy data or health data, but consumers do have a sort of expectation. We've grown up with this idea now that, for example, mobile phone numbers can be moved. We expect to be able to share our health data with different healthcare providers if we want to. So let me turn to you and ask, Jens, do you share data, and where is that pull coming from? Is it, as I'm suggesting, a consumer-led thing, or is this something that there's a use case for and you're suggesting from an industry side this might be very useful for you?
Yes, thank you, and also thank you for being a part of this session. Yes, we have actually voluntary data sharing today. The Danish pension and insurance sector has already significant experience within this voluntary data sharing within the industry. And just give you an example on that. The most significant data sharing scheme we have is what we call Pensionsinfo, which is around 20 years old. The scheme gives our customers a comprehensive, I would say, overview of their pension schemes. It's an online service, and it's also available 24/7, which gathers information on pension rights from all three pension pillars and from approximately 80 pension providers. It is a collaboration between the public authorities, pension companies, life companies, banks, and also savings banks. And in 2017, this turned out that the pension broker wanted to be able to receive data in a structured format. And also in 2019, we actually opened up for participation from fintechs as well. The key principles when sharing data is from a pension dashboard, and where it's actually based on a consent that each individual customers will give, and that's the opportunity for a bank or a information user to get the information. It is also driven by the sector. So it's an efficient way for customers to get an overview, and it's also a very efficient way to actually share data in order to give good advice across this sector, so to speak. Just to give you a couple of numbers, there has been year to date around 1.25 million transfers between pension providers and also 65,000 transfers to non-pension providers. And that is, you should of course see that in the context of the number of people or the population in Denmark. So it is actually quite significant use across this sector. So yes, I would say we actually have a lot of experience within this area.
Well, thank you very much. Obviously, there's always going to be leaders in any new sort of evolution of digital services in particular. Things move more quickly in some areas than others. Judith, tell us, what is the perspective in the German insurance market? I know that GDV has conducted a survey. Can you share some of the results with us? Give us an overview.
Yes, thank you. So first of all, totally agree with what Jan just said in his opening statement about that data is the future of our economy. And also have to say that the German insurance industry generally supports the European consideration on opening the financial data market. However, we have to see the current proposal quite critical, as it places a pretty heavily burden on the insurance companies as data holders, in order to having to provide a lot of infrastructure, have to bury the costs of the infrastructure. So especially in Germany, we have a very historically grown insurance market. The FIDA scope would affect with a big bang over 400 million policies. Many of them are probably not even digitized due to their age, because in the insurance industry we have very long-running contracts. There are some requirements that data needs to be shared in real time, which is also kind of a difficult requirement. And yeah, just seeing the scope is very, very broad. Also looking at the balance between all the players in the market, between the data holders and the data users and the customer in the same time, with a kind of an imbalance there, that we have data users who can get data from the insurance industry and the financial institutions. However, they don't need to or are not obliged to give data back. So, and you can also enter the market if you are a non-financial player. So it's very open to the whole industry. So there we see some of the issues. So yeah, at the moment we see some quite limitations to the FIDA proposal as it is. And also, yes, you mentioned the survey we undertook. I would like to show some slides about this a little bit later in the discussion, when we also talk about the use case approach, which is a kind of proposal we made. Instead of going with a big bang, just go with a use case approach. Some use case that is also kind of pulled by the customers, because we were talking about PSD2 as well. We see that PSD2 has not really been taken up by consumers as of today. And I don't remember when it was introduced, but I think it's been several years ago. And I had some numbers, heard that only 5% of consumers are really using PSD2 use cases so far. And there the question comes up, why broadening it, whilst we don't have a clear use case? And when we look at the way that data will be compensated, you always have to have the customer pulling the trigger or pushing for the data exchange to happen, and then a compensation would be given for the data holder to give the data away. So that's where we see some slight problems at the moment with the proposal.
Well, let's take some of those particular questions that you've raised. Jan, I'm going to, as our Commission representative, put them back to you. Judith has talked about scope. Why such a broad scope? You mentioned, you touched on as well, PSD2, the revised Payment Services Directive. Is this a broadening? Is this an evolution, a revolution, or perhaps even a leapfrogging? How would you style it? And what are the learnings that we can take from PSD2? And Are they fulfilled? Is now the right time to move on? Give us a bit more insight into the Commission reasoning.
Yeah, thanks very much. I think a lot of important points, which and very pertinent points. And I think if this is really supposed to be a joint endeavor, it's important that there also is a common understanding on them. So maybe just to react a bit on the PSD2, indeed, I think we have, let's say, done a thorough review of the PSD2. I agree with you that the uptake is not yet, let's say, as what maybe some would have hoped for. I think there are different reasons for this. I think also, let's say, given that the PSD2 indeed is not based on, let's say, this approach of collaboration, and indeed, actually, you need to, under the PSD2, you need to make data available without a compensation, basically, without being recovered your costs, without your costs being covered. That means that there's, of course, not a huge incentive actually to also provide effective infrastructure. And we've unfortunately seen that, let's say, some of the data and the API infrastructure which was provided was, let's say, really only a minimum compliance effort. And so it's not surprised in a way that then if it is something which is formally compliant but doesn't really actually work in practice, that then indeed the uptake is not very, very big. But we have honestly, we have seen quite some interesting uptake. We have seen the uptake in the traditional cases expected, but we've also seen uptake in new use cases which were not really expected. Just give one example, buy now, pay later is a growing market, and I think we are all concerned that that firms need to check the creditworthiness of customers before giving them credit in a way, and that's something where kind of quite interesting use cases have developed around using PSD2 data actually to do quick checks on these things. Just to give one example, nobody would have foreseen that, let's say 10 years ago, but actually it seems to be happening and seems to be quite successful. So I think we are probably, we have the impression that still some development to come here on the PSD2 side, and we have indeed just also proposed targeted improvements actually to really now reap the full potential of the PSD. In the going beyond the payments data, so in financial sector in general, in FIDA, precisely, also to make sure that there are indeed incentives to provide high quality infrastructure, we would allow, indeed, as you also mentioned, we would allow the data holders to request compensation to data users, not for the data, because of course we're talking about customer data, but for indeed making available the data, and for indeed actually setting up the infrastructure to make the data available. So I fully recognize indeed that this is linked with significant costs, and that why is indeed we find it also fair actually to that if insurance companies put up these infrastructures, that they can indeed then also require compensation for this. We also have the impression that insurance companies will, in the end, then not only be, let's say, data holders who give access, but that they will also actually themselves make use of data, let's say maybe held by other institutions, and indeed also be data users, so that indeed we will have a situation where actually it's not, let's say, one against the other, it's not the insurance against the fintechs, but I think it will be a much more diverse environment in a way, I have the impression, where actually everybody is sometimes acting as a data holder and sometimes as a data user in a way.
Well, Jan, before I ask Jens and Judith to comment on that, let me ask you for a quick clarification, because we have a question online. Sebastian Fitzler has asked, is there a concrete timeline when FIDA should be in place like PSD2, or is the initiative at proposal concept stage? Or what's the answer to that one?
So the answer is that it's the latter. It is a legislative proposal from the European Commission, and the way it always works is that this is now something which the European Parliament and the Council of Ministers are actually discussing and deliberating. So it's not in our hands as the European Commission to say what time frame this it will be, but let's say I think it is a minimum something which will take a year's time and probably even a bit more. And then, as always, there are, of course, implementation periods and other matters, but I think that's also something subject for further discussion, I think, and also exchange in the Parliament and the Council, what would exactly be the time periods actually for this to be implemented.
Thanks for the question, Sebastian. Indeed, these legislative proposals in Brussels do take time. And of course, next year we do see a change in the Parliament, which delays things a little bit further in this instance. But at least we're talking about it now, which means we can possibly get ahead of the game.
And maybe if I can add one thing on this, basically, I mean, I think we have really, our proposals really take this industry-based, industry-led approach in a way. And I honestly, in the first exchanges in Parliament and Council, I have not really seen a lot of opposition to this. So in a way, even though, let's say, it may be still some time off until this legislation actually becomes law, and we don't really know the exact shape, but I think it's never too early for industry actually to maybe even start thinking about this and get going even earlier. This is not the traditional legislation like capital requirements or others, where basically, well, you try to delay it as much as possible, and then when it comes, you do the minimum. But here, I think the best approach on this is to take this proactively, and then I think one can shape it as well. So that's also a bit, I think, an encouragement we would have to also take these proposals already now as an encouragement for reflection and consideration in a way how also the insurance sector wants to move forward. And I think Jens has shown really how much this is partly already the case in some member states, which is great. And indeed, I think our proposal also recognizes these already existing schemes, of course, where data sharing is already happening. There's no need to create parallel structures.
Well, Jens, I'm going to come to you and ask, as Jan said, how would you shape it? What would you agree with? Where would you like to see some pressure brought to bear, given that there is some time still to do that?
Yes, thanks a lot. I would like just to emphasize a couple of things, at least 3 things I have put on my note, and I think it's to build a bit on what Judith said. First of all, I think there's something around the broad scope that we're looking into in terms of customer data. And I'm especially concerned around what I would call intellectual property or enriched data, which is at least some area that I believe is a challenge when we look into how it's actually defined right now. Because I believe there is areas here for each individual company that is closely related to the business area, and where you actually do have some sensitive business aspects. So that would be one area. I would call it the broad scope, which I think is an area we would like to discuss and we need to look into. And I do not agree with this, and that is because especially enriched proprietary data is actually very, very important for each company. Then I believe that the costs we are looking into then, and yes, there are positive aspects of being able to have some kind of cost remuneration on it. On the other hand, I believe that looking into the sector and also, of course, smaller companies within the industry, it is potentially a quite costly dimension to go into. Maybe a number of people believe that each individual company and the sector has all the cost all the data points ready and just to display it. I believe a number of customers are working with being able to have a data platform and actually provide it into such a setup and infrastructure that is potentially a cost driver for the sector. And the third part is the timeline. You were a bit into it, Jan, but the timeline, looking into I believe it's around 18 months. I believe it's actually, to be honest, it's quite unrealistic to be able to implement such a significant change. There's platform infrastructure, a number of other aspects into that. So that will be my main 3 areas that I think is quite relevant to dig into.
Thank you, Jens. Judith, I noticed you nodding along. Presumably you agree with a lot of what's being said by Jens there.
Yes, definitely do that, especially as the current proposal also doesn't really lay out specifically what kind of data needs to be shared in which form. So this is probably maybe a question to Jan. Part for the economy to solve this or to agree on this in these financial data schemes that we may be talking about in a bit. On the other hand, totally agree with what Jens said. All the 3 points, the cost driver, the timeline, which is too tight in our opinion. So we are also pledging for a longer time period for the implementation of FIDA. And this third thing, also very important, is the sensitive business areas that Jens just mentioned. Depending on which kind of data in which format needs to be shared, there's always a risk to giving away business secrets to the public, because you could easily, through reverse engineering, get information about algorithms or how insurance companies enrich their data with which information. So there we don't see a clear guidance yet in the proposal how this could be avoided. And maybe one additional point from my end, in other acts, for example, I think in the Digital Markets Act, we see some gatekeeper regulations. So to avoid that the Big Four are kind of pulling too many data or entering too easily in the market. We haven't seen this with FIDA so far. Are there discussions about this? Are other players raising these questions as well? That would be also a concern.
Well, Jan, do you want to take some of those questions and see if you can allay the fears?
Absolutely, because I think they're all, again, very important points. So indeed, Jens, I think you, and for transparency, we have actually exchanged a lot with Jens also in our financial data expert group, which has, let's say, given some input, also critical input on our reflections on our side, basically. So it's very good indeed to exchange on those things. And I think I would first want to share fully the points you and Judith made on the protection of trade secrets and of intellectual property. And so this is something which we have taken up in our proposal. And I'm not normally kind of wanting to go into legal nitty-gritty, but let me in this case quote indeed from our proposal. Indeed, it says in this Article 5, when making data available, the data holder shall respect the confidentiality of trade secrets and intellectual property rights. Now, we could probably all write 550, 500, 5,000 or 5 million pages on what this means in detail. We are just not sure that, let's say, it will necessarily add clarity on it, because probably more likely tomorrow then we'll have another case we haven't thought about in the 5,000 pages. So we have tried in our proposal to enshrine exactly those principles which you also have, let's say, pointed out and which we fully share. There's certain data which is the essence of the financial services business. And of course, it would be stupid to make this open to data sharing, and it would be against legislation on trademarks and on intellectual property. We have, I think, from our perspective, the best approach here is to state the clear principles here, and then indeed it would be, that's also a bit to your point, it would be then of course also up to these data sharing schemes actually to implement this. And there we do then have a bit of trust in the market. Yes, we could spell this out all in detail in the legislation. Will the legislator get it necessarily better than the market? I'm not sure. If you have these data schemes where indeed you have all sides on the table, so let's say the data holders, then fintechs who maybe are not necessarily data holders, so data users more, and then you also involve the consumers, let's say, to have their share. Then we are quite confident that actually the outcome of these, let's say, discussions can be a good one, and it's no need for the legislator to let's say, put all of this in detail into a proposal. Maybe one second point I wanted to focus on is the gatekeeper point, which Judith, you mentioned now also again. We fully agree, and well, for good reasons, the EU has recently agreed and is now enforcing actually the Digital Markets Act and the Digital Services Act, which recognizes the special responsibility of large platforms like Amazon or also Apple iOS operating system. And indeed, as you know, under the Digital Markets Act, actually any company can also, if a consumer active on these platforms agrees, can access indeed, based on the Digital Markets Act, the data held by these platforms. So we have indeed created a new access right, which will be in force within a couple of months, I think March next year. It will be practically applicable to those firms which have been designated as gatekeepers, indeed, which any company, including insurance companies, can make use of, provided, of course, that the data subject, the customer, the client, agrees to it in a way. And secondly, we are also aware that, of course, when gatekeepers then maybe, let's say, look in the financial sector for data, that there is a special responsibility. I would say the experience of the PSD2 is not necessarily that this is used in practice in a large amount. It is a bit more of a kind of theoretical, let's say, concern, because let's face it, gatekeeper platforms already have quite a lot of data, so they may not necessarily actually, that's at least the practical experience, they may not necessarily need much more than that. But still, it's important that there are safeguards. And so the safeguards we have proposed in our proposal is indeed that, let's say, only licensed entities can actually access data. And if within a group you have one licensed entity, only that entity can also use the data. So you could also not have a situation where a large gatekeeper platform sets up a small financial information service provider and then kind of pulls all the data out of the financial sector and then kind of forwards it on to the large platform in a way. That would not be possible under the proposal. So I think we have included a number of safeguards on this. I'm sure this is also a point for discussion in the Parliament and the Council. I just would suggest to keep in mind that the experience is not that this is a massive problem. So I would rather encourage also to see how can we make FIDA something which can, let's say, make other companies even more competitive against even the competitive threats also from gatekeeper platforms, rather than to see, well, how can I kind of completely exclude them, etc. So let's try to let's try to see how we can also take this as an opportunity actually to face indeed the competition from gatekeeper platforms as well.
Thank you. Yeah, and of course, the gatekeeper terminology, we know a lot from the DSA, the Digital Services Act. And I think you've probably answered this question, but I should acknowledge Martin Klein from Vorstand and Verband has asked who will be authorized to retrieve the data from the interface. Is it just a few payment service providers, as with the PSD2, or will insurance brokers, for example, also be authorized? So that's a given. You've covered that, I think. Yes, they will. Judith, let me come back to you to talk about the use cases. I know that you wanted to talk a bit about that. What are your views on the benefits for data holders?
Yeah, maybe this is also a good point to talk about the survey we did, because starting from a use case approach, or maybe having an agile approach in mind, we were asking our customers or consumers with a representative survey whether they would be interested in open finance use cases. And regarding the use case approach, I know that also in the discussions we had on FIDA, there was often this chicken egg problem where maybe I can share this. The one party said, the use case will start to exist as soon as FIDA is in place. And the other side was saying, but there's no use case. Why should we implement it? So we see a little of a chicken egg problem here. And sometimes I think Jan mentioned it also earlier, something like, the best approach would be to take it proactively, maybe even before it's a law or this proposal. Maybe I could chip in there and also say, if there would be a use case that's totally relevant to the economy, I think there would be a data sharing in Germany as well as it exists in Denmark. So sometimes there's the question a bit, so where is the use case coming from, or where could we see the chances? Because we really want to see them. And maybe we could see the slides for a minute and I can share with you some of the insights and where we can maybe also see a chance for the insurance industry. So if I could ask for the slides. I think they are. Just make them look for myself here. So which is generally a good message is that customers have trust in their insurers. So we were asking them, so do you feel that your personal data or your financial data is safe with your insurers? And over 89% of the customers said, yes, we feel that the data is safe with our insurance companies. Which is a good sign in my looking at the insurance company in the role of the data holder, that they might have an advantage maybe in comparison to third-party providers or comparison websites, that they have a advantage just in trust and can also set up a good portal or a good dashboard for their customers and harvest on that. If we go to the next slide, we were asking, okay, would you share your data with different insurance companies or with your banks or with third parties? And there you see the higher rankings there that most of them said further no or definitely no. And especially with third parties, the definitely no is with 56% of the highest. So we see that there's a lot of work to be done in winning the trust of the consumers to actively share data across many different companies. Because, I mean, Germany is a special place coming to being happy to share data, because Germans are quite conservative when it comes to sharing their data. So this might be different in other European markets. Maybe Jens can say something about how it goes in Denmark. But Germany might not be the most digitalized industry yet. I haven't said that. And if we go to the next slide, we also asked, so if you had the chance today to use open banking offers, we also had a clear sign that 46% said, no, I haven't heard of it before. So we were asking if they used apps like, apps that already compare based on PSD2, what kind of contracts you have with insurance or with different banks or whatnot, and gives you saving tips, for example. So most of them haven't heard of it. And this is a phenomenon, I think, that we could also transfer to FIDA, because if we don't make the effort to convince the consumer in the end to use FIDA use cases, there will be no compensation flowing for setting up the infrastructure. And so in the end, it would be all the burden on the companies, And also, would you use a overview if you had one? Most of the respondents said, no, I don't currently need that, or no, I don't want to share my financial data. And surprisingly, also, this is not on the slides, but we also asked if the survey participants feel that they have a very good overview over their financial data, and over 93% said, yes, I have a very good or rather good overview over my financial data. So at the moment, we see not a real likelihood for open finance use cases or open banking, but maybe it is the way that we just need the infrastructure, and then the use cases are flowing in and customers love it at the same time. But I think this shows a little bit the often forth where the industry stands at the moment. So there needs to be a bit more motivation to invest in this infrastructure in the end.
Thank you, Judith. As you say, Germany is maybe a special case. So Jens, I'd be interested to get your thoughts and reflections on some of those slides or trends, if you like, that Judith was highlighting.
Yes, thanks a lot, and also to you, Judith, for sharing. I do believe we have seen that in the expert group as well. There are some differences across cultures and countries. I guess, Jan, you also know that as well. That is something that's impact the way we see how different digital solutions and also data sharing aspects is growing. So I believe we need to have that into consideration, and I also believe that what Judith said in terms that could be an approach to take this use case approach, and also maybe focusing on where do we start in terms of some of the other aspects that has been coming out from you, Jan, and all those aspects. Say, can we find an approach where we both work on the infrastructure and the platform, and also from a use case perspective, in order to have a more long-term perspective? Because of course there is some opportunities and potential in these aspects, but I do believe, as you said, Judith, earlier, an use case approach could actually be a way forward. And then of course there are different approaches and different cultures, and that also means that some countries or some markets will potentially have a more focus or more speed on this change. Others will have some other aspects into this. And looking into Denmark, we are actually a quite digitalized country, and that also goes from the public sector that has forced change within this area. So I believe that could be one aspect that you need to have into this context as well.
Thank you, Jens. Now, I see quite a lot of questions coming in. No surprise, Jan, when there is a Commission representative on the panel, a lot of them are directed at you. So let's start with one from Christos Livaris from Insurance Europe regarding the question of gatekeepers. How can we ensure that FIDA is properly aligned with the Data Act on several areas, including the obligations of data users? I think that's one that would be one for you in particular. We'll come on to some others and perhaps allow Judith and Jens to weigh in them as well.
Look, I think from our perspective, we've made a proposal which is really aligned with the Data Act, taking into account that, of course, as I think we discussed before, I mean, data is not data. Is not the same as data. There are differences basically. And for example, to give one example, in our proposal, we have indeed, I mentioned that before, we have said only people who have somehow a financial services license, may it be a kind of financial information service providers, but a license with a financial supervisor basically, and only those firms which are also subject to ICT risk management requirements, etc., only they can access data. That is not something you find in the Data Act, for example. The Data Act or the Digital Markets Act, basically, I mean, that's open for everybody, and you don't need to have any license, you don't need to have any safeguards or anything. So, and why is that? For good reasons, because we find in the financial sector there is indeed supervision in place, and that should extend also to the data users then, basically. And so I think that's an example where, let's say, there are sectoral specificities which need to be taken into account. But let's say with that proviso, I think you can find a lot of articles of our proposal which even are to the word, let's say, copy and paste from the Data Act. So I think we are quite. We agree on it, and we try to follow this really as much as we can.
Thank you. Another question, this time from Pablo Pascal from Insurance Ireland. I'll put it to you, Jan, but Judith and Jens, I'd like you to possibly consider where industry might also be able to play a role. Pablo is asking about the potential synergies on consumer protection regarding financial literacy and what support requirements might be considered for consumers without access to technology or who are not particularly technology literate, and what protection requirements are put in place for active and passive pressure from financial information service providers to vulnerable consumers. Jan, have you thought specifically on that? And then also Judith and Jens, where does responsibility lie, in particular when we talk about vulnerable consumers or technologically illiterate consumers? So Jan, I'll let you go first.
Yeah, I think that's an important question, and I think one aspect of the answer is that we are not telling Europeans that they should go digital in a way. So if there are Europeans who want to stay with a paper file and with a face in front of them, that is their right. And maybe I want that even every now and then myself. And so we are not on a situation where we are kind of just moving everything to digital in a way. So I think that's in a way the first part of inclusiveness, in a way that you also continue to have the possibility actually to access services in a non-digital way. I think the second element here is that we are trying to establish some safeguards indeed for those customers who do share their data. First of all, that they have easy tools to navigate indeed the consent which they have been giving. So basically the so-called consent management tool, where basically all the consents for data access which you've been given should be clearly and easily visible. And I think the third element which we have included in the proposal is indeed to have particular safeguards also against financial exclusion, because of course data use can also create exclusion risks if, for example, your data profile is not particularly strong or other things. And so we have actually proposed to task the European supervisory authorities with indeed specific guidance on how, let's say, these financial exclusion risks in the use of data can actually be avoided. So I think those are just a couple of examples how both for those who actually are maybe not digitally, let's say, minded, and those who are more digitally minded, actually, we suggest actually to create a framework that is responsible. But I'm sure that Judith and Jens also have some thoughts on this, because it's really something which I think all companies in one way or another face also as a challenge, I guess.
Exactly. I mean, that was going to be my question. This is something across the entire stakeholders of the financial data chain have to take into consideration. So, Jens, where is responsibility for industry lying? Where is responsibility for, if you like, the enforcement layers of different services going to lie? Is it a push or a pull situation, I guess is what I'm asking, and where do you feel responsibility has to be placed?
Yes, thanks. Thanks a lot. I believe there are several aspects into this topic, which is quite relevant, I guess, for all of us dealing with customers every day. And I think, Jan, you have some good points in terms of what are you actually aiming at. I believe actually we need to say that there is a responsibility both on the regulator side, but also on on us as companies in terms of how can we actually support customers in the different aspects. And yes, the customers are different in their terms of digital experience, where they are in their life and how they actually use this. So looking at our local market, there is actually both a regulator aspects in terms of how we should be able to deal with these aspects. So we are obliged to make something possible for our customers, but we as a company also have an interest of being able to deal with our customers. So one aspect, for instance, coming back to the case of pensionsinfo in Denmark, one is actually you could go into a branch of a bank or in a pension company and actually have a dialogue physically and be supported there. That is one solution I see some places. So there is a combination of being either digital on your own or going into your provider and have a support in that context. So it is actually possible in terms of managing that. But I believe we all have a responsibility being able to support our customers or citizens, as you can call it in Europe.
Thank you. Judith, your thoughts, I'm sure you have echoed some of the points you've already heard.
Yeah, maybe coming back direct to the question from Pablo. So we as GDV, we're having a clear position on which kind of data should be shared or which part of data sharing should be obliged. So we say that the definition of customer data should be referring to what we limited to raw customer data. We also want to exclude data from third parties, like if you have an accident insurance, there you always have, or if you have liability insurance, they always have a third party data in there, and this shouldn't be scope of the data sharing. Also, like accident insurance, we would rather exclude from the FIDA scope to have a safeguard there to not sharing third party data, which isn't kind of requested in that case.
Well, thank you. We're coming on now to the data sharing schemes, as you mentioned it there, Judith. But I see a specific question from James Paget from FTI Consulting about the Commission's proposal and how much flexibility it leaves in terms of how these data sharing schemes could be established and run. James is asking, how does the Commission view the role of the European supervisory authorities in relation to the development of these schemes, and how can the ESAs help ensure the creation of a standardized framework for data sharing with the necessary safeguards in place? I know we're getting quite far ahead when we talk about enforcement and supervisory authorities, but it is something that we always have to bear in mind when we're looking at new proposals.
Yeah, I think from our side, we indeed, our proposal is that indeed these data sharing schemes should play quite a role here. Of course, they would need to comply, let's say, with the regulation, with the FIDA regulation, but it is relatively, let's say, general in its requirements, I would say. And then in a way it is up to, let's say, of course, let's say also the supervisors to just make sure that their firms are part of such a scheme, basically. But I think it would stop there. So you would not, let's say, have a second guessing of technical standards of API performance, for example, and other things by the supervisor. that is a different approach than indeed partly as we have seen in the PSD2, where indeed some of these things, let's say, were indeed then also looked at by the European Banking Authority. I think this is on purpose because we want to try. We're going to give it a chance actually to see whether maybe industry can and the stakeholders can actually do this better than the public sector. So let's see how it will go. But what I think on our side, definitely we would not recommend is to kind of have a let's say a double attack on these things. So I mean, if you have a scheme and then on top of it you have detailed kind of supervisory enforcement, that would then, I mean, it's either or basically. Either you take the approach where you say the focus should be on supervisory enforcement, and that is then I think a bit more what the PSD2 let's say model is, and it has disadvantages, but it has also worked in a certain way. Or you basically say, okay, you want to, let's say, just put objectives, and then indeed the stakeholders should, let's say, do it. And the fact that you have different stakeholders represented then should make sure that the outcome is roughly balanced, and then it's not for the public authorities to second guess all of that. So that's a bit the proposal we have made. And I would maybe also in that context come back to your point on the use case approach, which I find totally important. And pertinent. I think we have on our side reflected quite a bit on this, and our conclusion was it's in the end not, the legislator is not well placed to decide what are the use cases. I think because that would have, of course, also have been a possible proposal where we clearly say use cases A, B, C, D, and now all the data which is necessary for that needs to be shared. But we just don't think fundamentally that the legislator is well placed to see what can be a successful use case in practice. That's why, indeed, I think here the framework, let's say, that's why we decided to have a framework which is a bit broader in a way. And then within this framework, of course, I would personally expect the data sharing schemes to focus their work indeed on specific use cases and indeed to implement this by way of looking at indeed the use cases where there is indeed an actual demand. Because I think that is probably the experience you have from the existing schemes, and I think Jens, you also presented it quite well. The use cases you have, for example, on the pensions dashboard, I think that is a concrete use case and a quite relevant one. And then to see how this can be implemented. But so I think we would be fully supportive of this use case approach. I think we would be a bit wary from our side to kind of, however, to let's say prescribe in legislation for the next 5 years. Those need to be the use cases basically, because it may turn out different than you think. It may, like in the PSD, I mean, I think a lot of hope was on this payment initiation services. They have maybe not really been so successful, but then other things like, for example, this very quick creditworthiness assessment, like I mentioned, actually have been coming up and are quite good use cases in a way. And I think we need to keep that openness in a way of the framework, I would say.
Judith, do you want to weigh in there, just give your thoughts in response to the approach that has been taken?
No, I was just thinking, I mean, I find it interesting to get some insights on the thoughts that went into just also looking at the PSD2 year, and I agree. I was just thinking, okay, I understand the thought behind it to open it up, to broaden it up, and then let a use case grow on this. We were in our argumentation, we were thinking like, yeah, maybe it makes sense if we all agree, which is maybe a little bit unrealistic, to on a really cool use case, and we take a agile approach, an iterative approach, and just prepare the data that is needed for that specific use case. But to be honest, I also agree with Jan a little bit that this is has their disadvantages as well. So it's yeah, it's a difficult one, definitely. Especially, I mean, only thinking of agreeing on data sharing schemes or on a syntax in Germany alone, but thinking this EU-wide is really a challenge. So maybe also a question from my side, like, what's the idea of the European Commission behind? Is there going to be one data sharing schemes, or do you expect 5 or endless versions? And you can agree, oh, on this data sharing scheme, I'm getting more compensation for my data, so I rather take this one. And that there will be players that kind of, I don't know, hyperscaler or something like that, that get their extra margin on the data transfer. I don't know. What are the ideas on that?
I think I'll push this question right back to you. The proposal leaves this open basically. So we don't want to say for the whole financial sector what's the best scope of let's say data exchange and where the markets are basically. I think the one thing is would be clear from our perspective is that any data sharing schemes need to be open, let's say on a non-discriminatory basis to participants basically. So you cannot set up closed shops in a way and say, well, it's only the German insurance and nobody else who can come in. But I think that's anyway you wouldn't want to do basically. But beyond that, it's quite open. So and Jens, we discussed this in the occupational pensions area. I could quite well. Some of the existing let's say arrangements will probably already qualify under FIDA. And I can, given that this is a sector which is a bit more nationally kind of marked, I would expect personally that let's say maybe the schemes will develop a bit more on the national let's say basis basically. Other parts of the market, to insurance, I don't know, and honestly, in the end, it's not for us to decide. But the proposal is quite open and flexible on that.
Well, I'll bring in a quick question. That's probably our last one that we have time for from Roberto Signorini, who is from ANIA. Cross-sectoral data sharing offers a great opportunity for benefits to be realized by facilitating access to data outside the financial industry, for example, data held by car manufacturers, the energy sector, etc. Although the proposed FIDA framework is aimed at data sharing within the financial sector, why does it not allow cross-sector data sharing for financial institutions? Jan, do you want to ask?
Yeah, I think FIDA is not the whole world. I find it personally a good proposal, but it's just one piece of the picture basically. So we have, but I think we have from the Commission side put on the table quite a lot of good proposals. If you want to have access to gatekeeper platform data, you have the Digital Markets Act, which will really go live with access rights as of next March. If you want to have access to IoT data, the Data Act has direct immediate access rights. Also agreed, will go live, I think, in the course of next year. If you want to have access to energy data, you have the Energy Efficiency Directive already. There are already some areas there which are covered. We are working right now on a transport health transport data space. Further proposals in this area also to be expected. Let's say the further initiatives still under this commission. And then we have, let's say, other areas as well. So I think from our perspective, this is probably ultimately the right approach. Maybe if you had asked me 2 years ago, I would have hoped for the one law which covers it all. But in the detailed discussions with the colleagues, I think we realized that it's just not going further than the Data Act does with a few general kind of principles, common ones. It's just not possible, and it would not do justice to the specifics and also the special needs of safeguards in various sectors in a way, including the financial sector.
Thank you for the question, Roberto. But yes, it's not Lord of the Rings, one law to rule them all. I would like to have a quick look at a slide now that we have had a poll running on LinkedIn over the last week. It's not scientific, it's just getting a snapshot about what people who are interested in this topic do think. Now, we asked what is most needed in Europe for data sharing to work in the financial sector. 42% said legal obligation to share data. 37% said appropriate infrastructure, so not a big difference between those two. And then much lower at 12% each, consumer will to share data and industries will to unlock data. So I think that is quite interesting. As a wrap up, Jens, I'd like you to reflect on whether you find that surprising or interesting and tell me what you think is most needed for this data sharing to work going forward.
Yeah, first of all, I'm not that surprised that the surveys was actually saying those figures. I believe that one of the most important things right now is to make sure that we get the right fundament and infrastructure in place. And if we do that right, in I would say a strong cooperation with the regulators as well, then I believe we can create the fundament for actually having more of the long-term vision in place. So I believe that the fundament infrastructure aspects are very important.
And Jens, if those are delivered, where do you see open finance in 5 years?
Well, I think it's very difficult to actually say where we actually be. I'm more in favor of being able to kind of where is the vision to go to, and then actually use even maybe a bit more time on the fundament and infrastructure and get that in place, because then I actually believe that our vision will actually go in the right way. So that will probably be my political answer on that one.
Very diplomatic. Jan, same question to you. Where do you see open finance in 5 years?
So I would hope that procedurally that we have indeed the FIDA regulation agreed and also in place. Basically that we have a, let's say, diversity of data sharing schemes in Europe actually across the financial sector happening, some national, some Europeans, and that indeed on the first use cases, indeed this is actually working and people have made the actual experience with this. And this is also something which by that time then should actually have further strengthened also the competitiveness indeed of the financial sector in the data sharing economy, because this is knowing how to do data sharing is not a small skill in the future to have for the financial sector.
And finally, Judith, your thoughts where you see us going to be in 5 years' time, or where you would like to see us in 5 years' time?
Yeah, so from an industry point of view, in order for FIDA to be a success, there we need to find a balance between benefits, costs, and risks. So I think we need to see small adjustments to the proposal. I hope that we can learn from PSD2. I think there were many people involved already in implementing PSD2, also IT service provider, and that we get all the stakeholders at one table earlier this time. Having a good cooperation to set up a cool infrastructure that really is hands-on, makes sense, and is especially taken up by the customers.
Thank you very much. That's, I think, a great place to end. Makes sense for customers, makes sense for citizens, and is hands-on. And that would be a great place to be in 5 years. I hope we will be talking before then about how we implement it and about enforcement, but all of that still to come. Thank you so much for joining us today. I hope we got through as many of your questions as possible. Thank you to GDV for organizing the seminar, and I hope you have a great afternoon.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye.